Okay, so now that we know what critical thinking is, let's get into... first wondering where my chair went. But aside from wondering where my chair went, let's get into the basic building blocks of actually doing some critical thinking. The most fundamental... The three things are claims, issues, and arguments. And I just defined words in terms of more words we don't know again. So we'll unpack claims, issues, and arguments. Claims are the most fundamental atoms of critical thinking. Sometimes they're called statements, sometimes they're more precisely referred to as propositions, which are statements that can be true or false. And we don't have to know which one they are, they just have to be able to have some truth value. Like, today is Monday is either true or false. Maybe I'm recording on Monday, maybe I'm not. Maybe you're watching on a Monday, maybe you're not. We don't know what the truth value is, but it definitely either is Monday or is not Monday. It's either true or false. As opposed to something like, hello. It's a statement, but it has no relation to truth. It's not true that hello. It's not false that hello. In critical thinking, we're generally dealing with statements that can be true or false. Get rid of the hellos and just look at the facts. Might be true facts, might be false facts. Like today is Monday. Could be false, but at least it's something that can be false or true. So that's a proposition, also called a claim. An issue is a topic of discussion. When we say, hey, is that claim true or not? And decide to discuss and try to define the truth value of a proposition, that's when a claim turns into an issue, when we make an issue of it. So an issue is just any claim that's the topic. The real important, the bulk of critical thinking is what we do with issues. We argue about them. We make arguments. In English, there's sort of two definitions of the word argument. The word has a lot of, in common English, it has a lot of connotations of conflict and the general idea that arguments are bad, something you want to avoid or at least solve and then not have anymore. In philosophy, the word argument doesn't have that connotation. Argument means a connected series of claims that are intended to identify the truth value of some proposition. A bunch of claims that are connected to support some other claim. And as a whole group, the set of claims and all the logical arrows between them is called an argument. We care more about arguments in the sense of making an argument for something as opposed to the sense of an argument as in, oh, we had an argument, conflict. Arguments may involve arguments, and some arguments might be more productive if they had better coherent logical arguments. There's certainly overlap between the two kinds. I think that you will be more effective at winning your verbal conflicts if you have more coherent logical arguments, and presenting a coherent logical argument might preclude some conflicts. Make the truth very obvious, and then we don't need to really fight about it too much. So hopefully, philosophical arguments will do something to ameliorate conflict interpersonal arguments. And so an argument is just a bunch of statements that are connected to establish another statement. We use the word statements a lot of times. That's not fun. That gets confusing. Sort of like what I did with the word argument. Near the end there, I was just playing with you and intentionally using the same word for two different definitions. Which is confusing. I know it was confusing. That's why we generally try to avoid that kind of thing. It's called ambiguity, or no, it's technically called equivocation. But that goes in the what not to do section, which we'll get to later. So we know what an argument is, and much of critical thinking is about deciding whether an argument is any good or not. Whether or not we should trust its conclusions and rely on that argument. An argument is good if it is valid and its premises are true. What's a premise? Well, we have two kinds of propositions. Premises and conclusions. The conclusion is the position on an issue, the ending one. The premises are everything else that comes before and supports that ending idea. So premises are starting statements, conclusions are ending statements. An argument is sound, a technical word for good. Sometimes there's just too much vocab, I'm sorry. An argument is good if two things are satisfied. If all the propositions that go, the premises, propositions that go into it are true, and if the connections between them are valid. We'll talk about what that means in a later chapter, because it's a little complicated and very important, but for now we'll just sort of throw the idea out there that really what we're doing in critical thinking is weighing and examining arguments, which involves looking at the truth of the premises and the validity of the connections between them. Things we'll define later, but they're worth foreshadowing. It's also worthwhile to point out a few more easy misconceptions about critical thinking, Just like we had to be careful to redefine the word argument, it's not necessarily a bad thing. A fight, a verbal fight, is a different use of the word. We've stipulated a careful definition, and so made the word argument not a bad word for our purposes. Also, there's the perception that critical thinking is very negative. And yeah, that's basically true. Hopefully there'll be some creativity applied in being productively negative. You need some creativity, or else you're just saying everything's bad, which, even if it's true, is not very rhetorically advisable. If you're just saying everything's bad and just demoralizing people, well, that's why people choose closed societies a lot of the time. So critical thinking, yeah, it's pretty negative. But just as we made arguments not such a bad thing, is negativity such a bad thing? Maybe it's really bad, maybe it's, whatever. An important distinction to make in critical thinking is what the target of these critical, incisive, analytical attacks is. That matters a lot. We need to separate the idea itself from the person who has the idea, or threw the idea out there. Ideally, in critical thinking, we're just evaluating the merits and problems with ideas themselves. And so taking apart and showing that a certain claim is false or a bad idea or a misinterpretation or just plain stupid, ideally that pertains to the idea itself. Critical thinking runs into trouble, or at least gets critical thinkers in trouble, when the idea is very much connected to the person who had the idea, and so an attack on the idea is seen as an attack on the person. That if we point out an error in someone's reasoning, we're trying to get that guy fired because we hate him. And then he might react to that attack. So critical thinking is only safe to do in a safe environment. And many environments aren't safe. So sometimes you don't want to do too much public critical thinking. But it's worthwhile to point out that at least that a foundation for critical thinking to be safe is the idea that we're just evaluating propositions and not evaluating the people who said those ideas. Later on, when we talk about the long list of thinking errors, fallacies, we'll give that one a name. It's called the ad hominem fallacy. Ad hominem, to the man, Latin term again. One might ask why there's all these Latin terms. Well, Greek ideas that we got from Latin, but why not just say it in English? Two reasons. One, we like to look fancy and look smart. A lot of intellectual activity is just posturing, trying to make other people think that you're smarter than them. That's the bad reason. archaic reason is that back when these ideas were really codified in English 100, 200, 300 years ago, back then, well-educated English speakers knew a lot more Latin, and some Greek too. So back when these conventions were established, having some Latin and Greek terms was far less weird and jarring back then than it is today. And we're sort of stuck with the conventions. They made more sense when the rules made more sense back when they were written. But there is actually one good reason for these Latin vocab words popping up. Code switching. If I translated those Latin words literally into English, I'd have a sentence and then to the man. And to the man, that sounds like a real phrase. What man? Where is he? You'd have to be really on the ball to, in English, notice, oh, to the man, that's not a prepositional whole phrase. That's a specific noun for a vocab word. It would require some careful attention. If you weren't paying attention, you might get confused. By switching into another language, that's a big street sign in a sentence that, hey, something's changed, this is a specific noun or verb, this isn't a whole phrase, this is just a thing. Ad hominem, even if you don't know Latin, it sounds like a word. It's a term for a thing. To the man, it sounds like we're talking about some other guy, so we don't stay in English, rather we code switch into another language. And although it sounds jarring, it's jarring on purpose, because it's trying to clue us into the fact that, hey, this is a vocab word. And that's why, that's the one good reason why all these non-English vocab words exist in high-level academic, scientific, medical, philosophical, all the high levels of English have a lot of non-English words in them. And if you take my other course on the history of the English-speaking people, you'll know that English has a long history of stealing lots of words. So this, lots of words from other languages. So this tendency to throw Latin and Greek and definitely not English terms into English sentences is just a weird thing that's specific to English. Like, Chinese doesn't borrow all that many words from other languages. Pretty much modern Chinese words come from medieval Chinese words, which come from ancient Chinese words, and it's Chinese, Chinese, Chinese the whole way back. The history of English doesn't look like that. We have only a few short words that come direct from Old English. Most of it's borrowed from neighboring languages. So it's really for historical reasons that English loves to pull in all these non-English words. It's just a weird thing about our language. So if it's confusing, don't worry too much. Yeah, we know it's hard. English is a very weird language. Take my other class!